So it's my pleasure to make the introductory remarks for this event. I'm Tariq Samad. I'm the Director of Graduate Studies for the Masters of Science in the Management of Technology program at the Technological Leadership Institute. And I'll say a few words about our institute and our programs before I turn it over to this august group of panelists that we have lined up for you. I'm really thrilled that we got Judy Pennington to organize this panel for us. It's on the changing role of the CIO, a very dynamic and important area for all of us in the technology space. And we have, in addition to Judy, Tom Butterfield, who's the CIO of TCF. We have Khalid Kark, who's the research director for the US CIO program at Deloitte, and Tiffany Snyder, CIO of Animal Nutrition at Cargill. But let me start by telling you a little bit about the Technological Leadership Institute. Maybe I'll ask first, how many of you here are students or alums of any of the TLI programs? A good number, excellent, yes. And the majority are not, so very good. Part of our problem is that we are too much of a well-kept secret, so it's good to know there are people here who we haven't already reached out to through our programs directly. So we've been around as an institute for over 30 years now, or almost 30 years now. And it was under a different name for many years, but the Technological Leadership Institute has been our name for the last decade or so. We do two or three things. We are primarily a professional education center. We have master's degrees and some other educational programs as well, and I'll say something more about them in a bit as well. And really, our focus is on innovation, entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship, how companies grow through technology in different industries across this region and globally as well. And then we also have some what we might refer to as thought leadership activities, and this is an example of those, but we do some consulting activities. We are fairly active in the research and publication arena as well. We work with local industries in organizing events of various sorts as well. But the bread and butter of this organization is education, and our signature offerings are three master's degree programs. So there's a Master's of Science in the Management of Technology. That's the program that I lead. Then we have a Master of Science in Medical Device Innovation, and the leader of that program is Professor Dan Meridian, who's standing in the back. And we also have a Master of Science in Security Technologies. Then, as you can see, we have some graduate minors as well, and some short courses. And we think of our programs as kind of, and most of the students and applicants who come to us are coming to us as sort of an MBA alternative for technology professionals. And we also get students or applicants who are really more on the MBA side, and we tend to direct them to the MBA programs. If, say, you're approaching innovation and business and leadership not from a technology-centric perspective, but from some other perspective, perhaps a more finance-centric perspective. And we have a really great blog on our website up that was done by our prior admissions director, Shay Moa, about how an MOT degree, the management technology degree, differs from an MBA, and there's no right or wrong answer. They both have their strengths. And one upshot of Shay's analysis was, if you think of yourself as Mark Cuban, then you're an MOT kind of person. You analyze opportunities from a technology orientation. If you think of yourself as a Kevin O'Leary, then you're more of an MBA type of person. You're interested in the bottom line, in the numbers. So more information on all our programs is available online, of course. And with that, let me introduce Judy Pennington. So Judy is an IT transformation expert. She's spent more than 30 years in industry, various sorts of leadership activities related to workforce transformation, leadership development, change management, organization design, all in the IT and digitization space. Most recently, she was managing director with Deloitte Consulting, where she was a CIO fellow and involved in leadership activities there with, in particular, the CIO Next Generation Academy. She's also published quite a lot, articles for the Wall Street Journal CIO report and Deloitte's technical trend reports. we're actually really happy, and I'm really thrilled because we managed to recruit Judy to teach a new course for us starting this coming spring on digital transformation. So I'm really looking forward to that course. So with that, please help me welcome Judy, and I'll let her run the proceedings from here.
Well, that was a pretty fabulous introduction. I'll have to live up to it and so on. What he didn't mention is how I found this program was through a billboard. I was driving, it was like the 3 billboards of whatever that state was where that movie came from. I was driving home from one of my daily visits to the Galleria, since I didn't have that much going on, and I saw the billboard about the program. And I thought, gee, that sounds really interesting. So I Googled it and found out about it, and then set up a meeting with Tariq and some others, and so here we are today. So I couldn't be more thrilled. I think it's a fabulous program, and I'm really pleased to be part of it. I am exceptionally pleased to have our panel discussion tonight. Throughout my career, and yeah, it has been 30 years. I started when I was about 15. I was sort of just really a fast tracker around those things. And in fact, I'm double mic'd up. I was telling my friends at that table, I have this mic on, and I have another mic because we're filming this. So I'm kind of feeling like Taylor Swift. And somebody over there who took his glasses off and couldn't see me very well said, yeah, I mistook you for Taylor Swift, but at any moment I might break out in song, you never know. But we have a fabulous panel. When Tariq asked me to do this, I thought, well, I could visualize how I thought the conversation could be interesting, robust, fun, and really just exactly what I wanted. My first thought was Khalid Kark, who I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves, because I won't be able to do it justice. But Khalid and I were colleagues at Deloitte, and he has a fabulous research background. And I learned so much from him and the research that was done as part of our CIO program. And so Khalid came here all the way from Dallas just to meet with us tonight. So I couldn't be more thrilled. So I think I owe him several dinners, several lunches, I don't know what else, but probably something. Next we have and you'll probably be able to tell who Tiffany is in comparison to the others. Tiffany I actually met first a number of years ago at Cargill when I was doing some work with Cargill. And when I saw that she was in a CIO role for one of their areas, I thought, this is great because you might not know this, but there aren't that many women in technology, number one, and not that many CIOs. That was sort of a joke because everybody knows there's not very many. And so I was thrilled to have Tiffany here. And then Tom Butterfield, his reputation preceded him to me. I had heard about all of the great things that they were doing at TCF and how Tom could talk about it and create the vision of what they were doing and how they were doing it and so on. So I think we got the A-list here. And so I think you're really, really going to enjoy our discussion. So Khalid, why don't you give a little intro about yourself and, sing a song, do whatever.
So thanks, Judy, and it's great to be here. It's great to move away from 70 degrees to 30-some degrees. But no, I'm glad to be here and really looking forward to this conversation. My background has, as Judy said, has been research all along. I've spent about 15 years, roughly so, at various capacities doing research, and the last 10 years or so at Forrester, where I led the CIO practice. And then about 4.5 years ago, I joined Deloitte and continued in that vein to put thought leadership and eminence out there for CIOs. So I interact typically with anywhere from 100 to 150 CIOs every quarter in various capacities. And so got a lot of stuff in my head and happy to kind of share it as we have the conversation. Thanks.
Tiffany.
Yeah, so when Judy calls, you just say, yes, I'd love to do that. And I might actually come take your class. I'm sure that's going to be fascinating. So I've been with Cargill about 24 years, and I've been in agriculture all my life. So I grew up in a small town in Iowa my family owned a John Deere dealership, and so grew up with a cornfield in my backyard, and so I think it's just in my blood, and I've had multiple career paths at Cargill. I didn't start out in technology, but I think we'll talk about that a little later as well. So it's been a great journey, and I can't imagine doing anything else than technology and being at the forefront of some digital transformation in agriculture.
So as Judy mentioned, I'm with TCF. I've been with TCF a little over 3 years. I've spent about 30 years in my life being a technology executive, about half of that in IT and half of that in business and or strategy roles. I spent 8 years before TCF at Target. I was in charge of technology strategy for Target, including the entree into Canada from a technology footprint point of view. So there are lots of stories to tell about that time. One of the most critical things I learned in that journey is the level and intensity of change in the world driven by technology, more so than any other period, or at least technology from a computer point of view. So it's reshaped the way I think about the role of the CIO and the role of the CIO as an executive in the company, not just a leader of technology in the company. So that's been very helpful for me and formative in the 3+ years I've been at TCF.
Great, thank you. So to get us started, I've asked Khalid to kind of give his presentation on work that he leads at Deloitte around the CIO survey. So I'll let him give the details behind it, but there's some very rich information. And by the way, if you'd like a copy of the presentation, we don't have paper copies because then you just kind of like keep going to the front of it and you wouldn't listen to Khalid. But no, we would be happy to email it to you, so we'll figure out how to get your email addresses, so if you want to make sure you let someone know. So Khalid, do you want to get started?
So I may move around a lot. I'm not used to a static mic, but we'll see. So thank you, everyone. This is, as Judy said, this has been a labor of love. About 4 years of doing research on what we call the CIO Legacy Project. So we started with a very simple question, asking, how do CIOs as leaders build their legacy, right? What do they do differently? What CIOs actually have a legacy, and why do they have a legacy if they do, right? And that seemed like a simple question. It ended up being 4 years of research. And so I'll go through some of that, and I'll walk you through kind of some of our findings. But I just wanted to kind of acknowledge the fact that there's kind of iteration that we went around as we realized that there are many, many dimensions of what makes a CIO successful. And so we'll touch on some of them. We may not touch on others, but I'm looking forward to having a conversation with the panel and adding some more thoughts to it. So just to kind of give you a size and scope of the survey that we do every other year now, about 1,500 global executives, about 1,100 plus CIOs, about 300 or so CXOs, which is CFOs, CEOs, and others, really basically trying to understand what is the role of the CIO and where it's going. And just to summarize the conversation we had earlier this year, about 200 interviews that my team conducted, obviously the first thing that we realized that keeping the lights on, making sure things are running efficiently, effectively, et cetera, was a core responsibility of CIO. But in addition, we heard two additional things, which again, shouldn't be surprised to anybody who's kind of following that path for CIOs. But the two very simple tasks, or seemingly simple tasks, are one, transforming the enterprise business operations, right? My expectation as a CXO is that my CIO is going to transform my business operations, right? Digitize is the word that I'll often use. The second thing is that, and more we're hearing that from the conversations we had, was that the CIO is a lever for growth for our organization, right? Whether that is a new product or a new revenue line or whatever it is, right? So a lever for growth and a lever for transforming business operations, right? So keep those in mind as we go through the rest of the conversation, and we'll walk through some of the findings. But the first thing that, this is the first year where we asked the question and said, okay, typically from research background, I did the survey. We cut it by industry, geography, size, and we found the differences, and we said, oh, financial services tends to be different in this case, and so on and so forth. And we did this huge survey, again, 1,300 CIOs, and when the data started to come back, I was kind of analyzing the data, and I realized that the data was not varying by industry or geography that much. And I'm like, this is my first year at Deloitte. I'm like, holy cow, this is not a good survey. What do we do? And so we started looking deep into the data to figure out, okay, so if they're not differentiating too much by industry or geography, how are CIOs really differentiating in the way they add value to their companies? And what we uncovered, kind of slicing and dicing and cutting the data different ways, was that CIOs tended to gravitate to these three patterns. And across the globe, across industries, across geographies, across size of companies, it didn't matter. CIOs tended to gravitate to these three centers of gravity. And these three things are the three ways they're actually driving value for their companies, right? Now, interestingly, what we also found as we did that research was that each of those patterns, we call these patterns, tended to act and behave differently. Because they were adding value differently, their mandates were different, they tended to act and behave differently. And so what was interesting was that we found that roughly 55% of the global CIOs were viewed, and their mandate was a trusted operator. Their primary responsibility in their organization was to make sure things are running effectively, efficiently, reliably. That was their job. And about 33%, a third of the CIOs were business co-creators. Their job was to drive growth and revenue and come up with strategies that's going to grow the business and so on. And another 11% were change instigators. They were the driving force for the business. They were the ones instigating change for the business, right? And what was interesting was that over time, as we looked at data, we had a lot of questions about where do you see your organization in the next 3 to 5 years? Where do you see yourself? Over time, when we extrapolated the data, the numbers looked very different. So aspirationally, a lot of CIOs wanted to be business co-creators, but in reality, there were a lot of them were trusted operators. So the second year in the survey research, we found, okay, what can we do actually to move between these patterns? These are not like personality types where you're stuck with a pattern, right? It's actually a group of people that act and behave differently, so you can learn from them, right? And so the whole research the second year focused on how do you shift between these patterns, right? Just to give you a kind of a very, very high level view, trusted operators tended to rely on technology and operations. They tended to have a huge amount of experience in running huge, complex technology shops, right? They did that really well. Business co-creators tended to leverage their relationships. They were relationship people. They had the widest and the deepest relationship in the organizations. And the change instigators were people who actually leveraged talent. They invested significantly more, 20 percentage points more sometimes, on building, retaining, engaging talent that can drive change on their behalf, right? And so we found these interesting kind of levers that each one of these patterns used as they drove value for their organizations. And then we asked the perennial question, is it nature or nurture, right? That matters in building a legacy. And I'd like to ask the audience, what do you guys think? I mean, for a CIO, what is it, nature or nurture? In terms of building a successful legacy. People who say it's nature.
Raise your hands if you think it's nature.
Nobody thinks it's nature. Okay. One. Okay. What about nurture? So everybody else thinks it's nurture. About half of the people. Okay. So what was interesting was that out of the 20 attributes of nature and nurture that we looked at each, only 2 attributes of nature actually mattered when building a legacy. It was all about nurture.
It was all about skills that you build and skills that you kind of gain as a leader, right? So now nobody has an excuse that, oh, I grew up in IT, I can't be a business savvy CIO. It's all nurture, right? So as you move and as you shift, it's your adaptability to move between these patterns that allows you to be a successful CIO. So I'm going to go through a lot of slides really quickly, and we'll come back and address some of those comments, but I just wanted to kind of set that context before I went through some of the other slides. So this year, what we did was we looked at and said, okay, so how do CIOs drive transformation for their organizations? That is one attribute that helps them build their legacy, right? And so we said, okay, they need to look at three things. They need to look internally, what do they need to change themselves? How do they redefine their role? Secondly, they need to reimagine how they deliver technology, how technology is being delivered to the organization. And the third is, how do they look at platforms differently and offer those platforms differently, tech platforms, to their organization. So those are the three angles that we looked at. And what we found was really interesting. So we said, okay, who are the leading edge people who are actually making a difference? And we looked at two questions we asked. One was, what is your perception in your organization? As you perceived as a leader, as a laggard, as a something in between, right, within your organization, right, in driving digital capabilities. And the second question was, do you actually have a digital strategy, right? That led us to believe, because if you don't have a digital strategy, that means it's the CIO's kind of lone fight at that point, right? Trying to drive some of the change and so on. So how effective is business in helping you and providing you the air cover to drive digital, right? And what we found was the intersection of those two questions, if you had a digital strategy, and if you're viewed as a leader, was only 9.7% of all our survey respondents, right? And we call those digital vanguards. And throughout the survey, when you look at the survey, we'll send you the link, we kind of compare digital vanguards with all the other CIOs in the survey, and they tended to move, again, differently in many dimensions compared to the CIOs today. So let's talk about some of those dimensions, right? So the first thing that they do differently, digital vanguards, is that they tend to, oh, by the way, if you look at the pattern type, they tend to be, anybody want to guess what is their predominant pattern? Digital vanguards? They tend to be business co-creators and change instigators a lot more than trusted operators, right? They're in the leading edge of driving change, right? So they tend to be business co-creators and change instigators. But what they do effectively and really well is that they do tech fluency, what we call tech fluency. And so what is tech fluency? So for a long time, CIOs and tech people have been asked to understand the business, right? How many have heard of that, right? As a technologist, you have to understand the business, right? I think the flip is true today. As a business person, you need to understand technology. If you don't, you're not going to survive the next 5 years as a business leader, right? And so tech fluency is a way to educate your business and make them fluent on how technology can help drive their business, right? And they don't do brown bag, or they do actually brown bag lunches and kind of overarching kind of company-wide tech fluency, what's AI and all that. But what they do really, really effectively and differently is they have one-on-one or focused conversations with individual business areas to say, this is how technology is going to drive your business. This is how technology is going to help you, and so on. And what we found interesting was that if you actually were doing tech fluency, you're 1.5 times more likely to report a strong relationship with an executive, right? Not only did digital vanguards have better relationships with the front office and the back office, which is kind of this chart, right? But they tended to have deeper relationships because they're now equipping their business leaders to understand and think about technology differently, right? So that's really interesting. And again, across the board, we found that they had better relationships and deeper relationships with the business leaders. The other thing that was interesting was that CIOs that tended to be on their leading edge tended to have much more conversations around innovation and disruption. We did some other research where we kind of understood and tried to figure out, based on 10K filings, in board conversations, when technology is brought up, you want to guess how many times cyber is the topic of conversation? Anybody want to guess?
50%.
More than 50%, right? So it's all about defense. All board conversations are about defense, right? Now, I think that's important and essential to have that conversation, but you got to balance it with offense, right? What are you bringing to the table? How are you going to grow the business as a technologist, right? So what we found was the more engaged and interacted the more interaction you had with the board, the more likely you were to have those conversations, right? So this data shows actually that the more frequent you have board conversations, the more likely you are to have a balanced set of offense and defensive conversations, right? So that was interesting because, again, if you don't have a lot of board access and the board is not driving a lot of digital, that's not going to give you a lot of room to play with in terms of kind of bringing those ideas and thoughts. And I was actually talking to Justin, who had a really good trick. Justin is the CIO of Cargill. He said, you know what? I put a lot of my operational stuff in the pre-read, right? So and when I go to the board, I want to talk about just the offensive part, how we're going to grow the business, right? So there are kind of tips and tricks that you can have to kind of drive some of that change, but that was interesting. The other thing that we found really interesting was that CIOs tended to have a decision-making process that was very siloed, we thought. When you look at how IT governance is done, I was surprised. Even the digital vanguards weren't too different here. You look at the green bars, they're actually not that good either. They're better than others, but they're not that good either in terms of how they're kind of doing IT governance. And I think this is one area, if nothing else changes, if this changes, it allows for a better two-way dialogue between what the business leaders want and what the technology can offer, and have a conversation around it. So again, I think there's a big gap that we found that I was kind of unexpected to me. But the one thing that, if you were to ask me, the one thing that surprised me a little bit was that how significant and how fast this change is happening. So this is a look at how IT is spending their money, right? It used to be not too long ago where IT used to spend 70% of the budget on keeping the lights on, right? Today, it's 56%, right? Now, what is interesting is 56% on keeping the lights on, running business operations, 26% roughly on enhancing business or incremental business change, and then roughly 18% on innovation, building net new products and services for the company. Now, what is interesting is over time, there's a desire for a lot of CIOs to do more innovation, spend a higher percentage of budget on innovation. But what is fascinating is you look at the digital vanguards on the right side, and you look at where they're going. That means a third almost of the budget being spent on keeping the lights on, doing enhancements, and driving innovation. If you think about it, a third of IT budget being spent on innovation, building new products, and the next year, that's going to be operational spend. You're going to be asked to build 33% new products, right? So the pace of change that IT is going to experience in the next 3 to 5 years is going to be unprecedented, right? I know of a Fortune 20 CIO who brought together the IT organization and said, you know, I understand you're going through all this change, and this is hard for all of you, but mark this time, you're never going to see as little change as we're going through now. You're always going to have more change from now on, right? So he was just preparing his organization that the road ahead, the velocity of change is going to be much, much more significant. You're just starting to see the beginning of it. The second thing that I thought was interesting from the data was that skill sets. Right? We all know cyber and AI and emerging tech are skills that CIOs are hiring for. When we ask them about soft skills, right? These are the things that came to the top: creativity, cognitive flexibility, and emotional intelligence, right? And what CIOs said was very fascinating. They said, you know, I can hire a person that has these skills and train them on tech, but it's going to be very hard for me to train a techie on these skill sets, right? So how do you bring those skill sets How do you balance that skill set to drive change within your organization? And that's the problem that many, many CIOs face today. I was talking to a CIO who said, I anticipate in the next 3 to 5 years, 53% of my workforce is not going to exist. 53%, that's half of your workforce, right? He's putting together $8 million of retraining program for his workforce so that he can re-employ them in different roles, right? That's the type of change that we're talking about. That's the type of skill set shift that we're starting to see. And then culture. So one thing that we found really different for digital vanguards was that they actually used culture as a way to attract top talent. And anybody want to guess what is the number one thing that retains employees, top employees? Challenge? That's pretty close. Anybody else? Flexibility? Actually, it's not flexibility. Flexibility is a table stake expectation today.
Relevance.
Relevance. But it is, so the way I put it is, it's actually engaging with emerging technologies and solutions, on being on the leading edge, right? If you go in and you're managing the traditional IT operations, that is not going to excite the talent today, right? So it's emerging technologies and solutions that actually are the number one reason people actually stay, and especially the higher talent, stay in their organizations. And culture is the other one, right? What kind of culture do you have? Do you have an innovative culture? There's a thing called a talent brand. I don't know if you know this or not. When people come here for university recruiting, every company has a brand. If you haven't spent time curating your brand, guess what? You still have a brand, and it sucks, right? So the point is, every company has a talent brand. What is your brand? Have you thought about it as a leader in your company, what talent brand your company has, right? And then last couple of things, you would think that digital vanguards are on the leading edge and they're not going to worry too much about cybersecurity or security being part of. You know what? Actually, they do worry about it much more. They think of security as much more strategic than the average CIO. They're embedding security into their products and services early on so that they don't have to bolt it on later on, right? So they view security to be much, much more strategic, which was a little bit of interesting, right, for digital vanguards. And then I'll leave you with this last thought, which is all of these things we've heard about. We've heard about over a number of years, yes, that's how IT is changing, that's the expectation. But the one net new thing that we thought CIOs are being asked to do today is to build a capability of innovation. I had never heard that before 2 or 3 years, right? It was never an expectation that CIO is going to enable or drive innovation, but today it is, right? Emerging technologies are a big part of any corporate strategy, and the CIO is expected to be part of that strategy, right? So as a leader of technology, how are you going to bring that innovation capability? We call it, in Deloitte, we named it industrialized innovation capacity, right? How do you build that? And the thing that we found was that many CIOs are involved in parts of it, but nobody's involved in the whole life cycle of actually starting from sensing and scanning to researching to exploring and then scaling up those technologies and innovations and solutions, right? So the point is that many CIOs get engaged in sensing and scanning. Some are invested in research. Some are saying, okay, the business tells me what to do and I'll go out and explore, right? And in another quarter say, okay, you just kind of experiment yourself and we'll help you scale, right? But nobody's actually involved in all 4 of these phases across the board. Very few companies are, right? And so the point that we have for a lot of CIOs is, think of this as a capability that you're going to build. You may not lead every portion of it, but what you will be expected to do is to contribute to each and every component of building this innovation capacity, because I've had many conversations with the board members who say, we anticipate 70 to 80% of our innovations are going to be tech-enabled. If that's the case, what is the role of CIO in driving that change for their company, right? Very, very significant. So I just leave you with that thought, and again, happy to have a conversation on any of these topics or anything else.
Okay, great. Thank you, Khalid. So using Khalid's presentation as sort of a foundation, and I'm sure you've all memorized everything that he talked about, I'm going to ask now our panel members. And for this, feel free if you have a question to raise your hand, and we'll make it somewhat interactive, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end as well. But Tiffany, perhaps we could start with you. When you think about the three patterns, the trusted operator, business co-creator, and change instigator, what are you expected to do in your role, and has that changed and evolved over the last 3 years or so?
So I read this in advance, and I see echoes of all three. So I would share with you 4 or 5 years ago, when I think about our strategy and what we were trying to achieve from our global IT function, it was very much about trusted operator. We were really focused on operational excellence, getting more cost tiers and service options so we could match that to our different markets, and really working to build the brand of IT with our leaders. It has shifted dramatically. And so today we're involved in driving strategy for the organization, leading digital transformation in our industries, and really looking at how we use digital to transform our value chains and offer new products and services to our customers. But the thing I've learned, that doesn't mean you can take off the hat of trusted operator.
Right.
So it is an evolution, and it's accretive to, you got to do the basics right. And then grow your relationship and add more value to the business, and pretty soon you're sitting there working on how are we going to grow the business and how are we going to transform our value chain.
Right, because if the lights aren't on, you don't get to do some of the other stuff. So Tom, how about you?
I was telling Khalid, I think his framework really resonates with me. It's intuitive, but it's also experiential. It makes sense. I've lived each of these roles in different parts in my career. The role I'm in right now, I'm really fortunate to be able to be in that change instigator role. And what I like about this framework is, I think there's 2 parts to this. One of them is, what do we want to do as leaders of technology? The other one is, what does a company want you to do or allow you to do? So this notion that I might sit in a trusted operator role and I really want to be a partner role and I'm trying to push up against that ceiling, it's about the culture of the company and whether that's interested in letting you do it. So for me, in the last 3.5 years with TCF, I joined at a time where there was a leadership change in the CEO ranks, and the gentleman that I work for, who was coming into control of the organization, was very clear about what he expected technology to do for the organization. In fact, he spent 6 months trying to hire a CIO. He went through 16 bank CIOs before he decided to hire a CIO who wasn't from banking, who was from retail, because of this point, of this desire to drive change. So I would tell you, and I'm trying to, as humbly as I think we can, we are driving the cultural change inside of this organization as a technology organization. We are setting the change, setting the language, setting the terminology. We talk about MVP thinking as a company. We talk about agility or agile with an A, capital A, for an organization. That all emanates from the tech organization. It took a lot of work to get there, took a lot of proving, took a lot of working your way through trusted partner, key business delivery, to shaping and changing the tone of the organization. But it's all driven by a CEO who knows what technology can do for his organization, has a sense at least, if not an intimate understanding, of the time in history that we're at right now and the role tech plays in allowing him to be disruptive in how he competes. And I think that's the open door to be able to operate, if you can and if you're capable, in that green box. And for me, that's what's been so fun about this.
So what happens if you don't have a CEO like that, and you go into an organization, or that you understand the organization might need something different? Do you have any advice about that scenario?
Well, I think we've all probably lived it a little bit, right? So you I think, are constantly trying to share context, or you want to be the key partner, you want to be there, you want to be trusted delivery partner, so you can be in the conversation so that you can share the broader context of change and the importance of the patterns of technology disruption that are happening in other industries and how that fits in the industry you're in, to be able to get a voice. Now, whether or not you can make inroads with that voice really depends on how well the folks you're talking to understand this notion. And Khalid and I were talking before, when I met him before the event. I see so often the folks that are technology change instigators playing the green role. I would venture to guess more than 50% of the time aren't CIOs. They're chief digital officers, they're the marketing person, they're the product person who has a tech background, and their credibility on tech disruption, for whatever reason, is higher in the organization than the credibility of the CIO for tech disruption. And a lot of that probably comes from the fact that the CIO's context is in the blue or in the orange.
I would just say, I mean, I think a huge part of our role in either of those quadrants is educator. And so, you know, really making sure that we understand the business that we're in and the needs of our customers and consumers and how those are shifting, and having conversations from that perspective. I mean, digital disruption is all around us. And so there are so many examples, whether it's a different industry or our industry, or look at where the venture capital funds are going. You know, it drives great conversations around, you know, we can be the disruptor or we can be disrupted, and there's lots of examples of that. And I think part of our role is to make sure this stuff isn't a black box. It's accessible. And I loved your comment on tech fluency, because we definitely used to get that, make sure you're talking in the language of business, don't use any technology, And now it's, you know, I have sat in a room with my CEO and the CEO of Microsoft, or, you know, we're meeting with the CEO of Amazon Web Services, and they have to learn the language of technology and business, and the lines are blurring. And I think we have a huge opportunity to be the translator in between there, and really help educate and understand how does our business need to shift.
Yeah, the comment Khalid made, which I found interesting, 70 to 80% of innovation is going to be tech-enabled. And so in order for that to happen, what do they have to know about in order to be open to it, and so on. The other thing that I'd like to add on to the question about this, both about you as individual CIOs, but also about your organizations. Khalid brought up this talent brand. Maybe it's my human capital background, but that is sort of interesting. You know, what have you had to do on purpose or just by osmosis had to do to learn to change in order to operate differently? And then importantly, you know, what is the talent brand of your organization? Maybe Tom, could you?
This has been a really interesting learning for me over the course of the last 3 years. So I think the thing that I did, a little bit intentional, a little bit lucky, when I started, was the importance of the people that I brought into the organization. And we've made an incredible amount of change. Some would argue way too disruptive. There isn't a single leader on the CIO team that was here 3 years ago. 70% of the management team is different. We've brought engineers and architects in. We've moved roles out that were BA roles, business analyst roles, in deference to technical roles. So culturally, we've created a much different technology organization with the emphasis on the T in technology organization. And that has created a talent brand, even without us necessarily trying to orchestrate a talent brand set of activities. Now, we've tried to harness that. We've brought in human capital management people, recruiters that are really good at this. We leverage social media even when we weren't thinking about it, and now we leverage it more intentionally. We did open houses that were early on that were entirely communicated through social media, just to see what kind of reaction we get. We get the majority of our new talent through social media networks from within the group that's there.
What about those soft skills that, again, Khalid referenced? So you need the technical skills, but what about those other skills?
They're critically important. There's no doubt about that, and it comes to how they interact with people. But where we've been focusing on is, again, putting the T in technology. So the folks that want to do new patterns, that want to be relevant, make a difference, to demonstrate what can be done, are intrigued. Now, that gives us a starting point for the conversation, and then we work on what are your soft skills and can you actually have a vision around that tech.
Yeah. Tiffany, how about where you are?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about where we're at, and I
Yeah.
think it connects to you talked about what are the cultural aspects that attract people. And when we talk about the purpose of Cargill, by 2050 we're projected to have 9 billion people to feed on the planet. And land is going to urbanization and everything else. So we're in the business of feeding the world in safe, sustainable, responsible ways. And that is a big challenge that people in technology are interested to come help solve. And so we talk a lot about technology with a purpose. And if you think about how are you going to produce more food in more sustainable ways with less land, it's all about data and analytics and precision agriculture and how do we help improve yields. And so as we're competing with talent with Silicon Valley and elsewhere, what we find is high potential talent want important, purposeful challenge to solve for. And we have really meaningful work to do in Cargill, and we're finding that's attracting people in. But once they're in, people want a diverse, inclusive environment. And they want a place where they can bring that creativity and they can thrive. And so we work a lot on our culture.
Yeah.
We have no shortage of big, interesting problems to solve. And it's connecting the right people with that, but then really turning them loose and letting them thrive.
Yeah.
And so more and more, our technology people are able to line up with our commercial people and go out in the field and literally touch our customers and see what those problems are and bring really innovative solutions to that. And so that's kind of the secret sauce that we're finding right now.
There's been a lot of research done around millennials especially, and their interest in doing something meaningful, being purposeful about what they're doing and helping the world and so on. Khalid, any comments that you have about, the 120 CIOs you see every month?
Well, I think the more interesting conversations are actually board member conversations we had. And so I never forget this comment. I was talking to this board member, and he'd worked with a CIO for 6 years. And it felt like he didn't know the CIO really well. And I'm like, you said you worked with him for six years. How often do you interact with the CIO? And his comment was, not often enough. I wish in the 6 years, if the CIO had reached out to me outside of the board conversation to have a deeper dive on tech, because that's the one area I really think I could use that. Now, the interesting thing was he didn't ask for it, right? But the other interesting thing was he was almost expecting the CIO to have that deep down conversation. And after that, I talked to a couple of the CIOs and said, do you do something like the ones that engage with board very regularly? And I realized that the savvy CIOs are already doing that. And once or twice a year, they would bring in 1 or 2 members of the board, do a half day, 1 day, deep down. Hey, here's our strategy, here's what we're doing, here are kind of specific tech angles that we're taking, here are the bets that we're making, etc. And what that does does 2 things. One, it obviously gives the board members a lot more confidence in how IT is really driving change within the organization. The second thing it does is it actually they have an ally on the board now. If they go to the board with a proposition, it's more likely to be approved, because now they've got people who understand. The board meetings are not a time to go deep into a technology discussion, right? So I thought those conversations, the board members, I would think, and in fact, it was a
I attended and I presented at that same board meeting. And anybody want to guess? They did one of those word clouds. Everybody had their cell phones on, and they asked, "What are your top 3 issues?" Right? And they put in their issues. Guess what number 1 was? Technology. Guess what number 2 was? Cybersecurity. Right? And so it's actually something that's gonna that really opened up my eyes in a way that said that, it's time has come where technology is really the driving force, whether we like it or not, whether we're equipped or not, whether we have the capabilities or not. And if the IT organization doesn't do it, as Tom said, it could be anybody who could come up in the organization and drive that change. Because that change is needed. That change is something that the leaders are clamoring for. And so it's a matter of who would raise their hand and who would step up. And I like to say to CIOs, either step up or step aside, because this is going to happen whether we like it or not.
So Tom, I think you mentioned earlier about your interactions with the board. Do you want to describe how that happened, what you do with them, and how did that happen? Did they ask you, or did you sort of proactively?
Again, it goes back to Craig Dahl, who's our CEO, and his orientation around tech. So preceding my joining TCF by about a half a year, we had brought on a member to our board, Rick King, who's a COO now, but formerly for a long time CIO at Thomson Reuters. Created a tech committee, one of the few peer banks that had a committee of the board of directors that's around technology. And from day one, it's been a tight, intimate connection. Rick and I talk on a monthly basis. On a quarterly basis, we have a tech committee meeting where we present the key initiatives going on, the key strategies. We don't focus on ops, we focus on enabling functionality. Although I will tell you that some of the best credibility we've gotten in those sessions is when we're transparent about our foibles and what we're not doing well, and we're honest about the progress we have yet to make. Because if you're a board member, it makes you feel like you're getting a balance, and you are getting a balanced orientation. On an annual basis, we do a half-day deep dive with the third of the members of the board around cybersecurity. So we walk them through progress, what we've seen, what we're doing. Again, this is where the EQ matters, right? Because you can very quickly go right over the head of anybody who didn't grow up in technology. And the majority of our board members, the average age is probably well over 60, so they didn't live it either from a business point of view. So we do our best to kind of keep the language as simple and business-like as possible, which you can do, but it truly creates a level of connectedness. I will say, just really quick, probably the most critical moment I've had in 3.5 years with the board, about a year and a half in, at our annual board retreat, I brought to the board a deck on technology disruption, and basically walked through how technology had disrupted industries before banking. Having spent 8 years prior to this in retail, it was very real for me. And I essentially laid it out, what the pattern looks like and what it feels like to be an executive who spent 30 years in an industry knowing and honing the rules of that game and knowing how to win in the rules of that game, only to have the rules changed completely underneath you, and not being able to realize that, and not giving up on the fact that the old rules apply. And my ending argument was, it's happening to us right now. So we can either sit and watch it happen, or we can get in front of it and we can be the disruptors, and here's what it would look like doing. And it was very meaningful. I think in a pivotal moment we did it. I think I ended the morning sessions, we had lunch and we came back, and very somber lunch. And one of the board members said, I just sold all of my shares. But it's the point. It's the point of change instigator is a bit of a shock role as well.
Right. I'll interject a little story here. I attended my niece graduated from medical school, and so I attended her graduation. And there was a woman who was the keynote speaker who was a cardiologist, but she was in her 60s, so clearly practiced for a long time. And the message that she gave to these newly minted doctors was around disruptors in the medical field, right? And because every field has disruptors. And so the message, the story she told was, she was a young doctor working in an ER, and a woman came in and had certain symptoms. They did some testing and sent her home. And she came back the next day and she had had a heart attack. Well, this was 60 years ago before they understood that women's heart sort of symptoms were quite different than men's. And her message to these folks, and I think one of the messages that I kind of hear from you as well, is we need to have intellectual humility about what it is we think we know. Because as soon as we think we have the answer, and he or she who has the hammer thinks everything is a nail, you don't see the forest for the trees. And so I think that's a really, that sort of competency around intellectual humility sounded to me like a pretty good piece of advice. Now, you mentioned, Tiffany, the interaction with your board as well. Is it a similar story? How do you kind of manage that?
Yeah, and Khalid did a nice job talking about, so Justin Kershaw is the CIO of Cargill, and reports to our CEO, and you did a nice job kind of framing up like his approach. But he meets with the board quite frequently, and I think has developed a really good relationship there. I will tell you though, we also have a phenomenal board who I think is constantly seeking to learn and understand. Many of them, run companies themselves, so are faced with this. And some of the agendas center around Cargill's a vast business across 60-some countries. We've got a lot of modernization to do. So there's discussions around what does that agenda look like to make sure that internally we're keeping up the pace and we're a modern company. Cyber is certainly a hot topic and one that opens the door for other conversations. So I think they have a very robust agenda about what's going on in cyber, and we're constantly under threat and attack, and we've got a lot of interesting investments in that space. And then the third is absolutely about digital disruption, and especially in agriculture. I think I mentioned already, you see a lot of startups, a lot of venture capital funds, and emerging competitors aren't the traditional ones, they're the tech companies. And so I think they've had a lot of, interesting conversations around that. And last year I was quite impressed actually when one of the board members and Cargill family members raised his hand and said, I really want to learn more. And we had a special session just with him to talk about what it is that we're doing, what he's seeing, and we had a great conversation. So we have fantastic people not only on our board but our executive team that are really in learning mode.
So let's talk a little bit more about digital. That seems to be the buzzword du jour. Maybe, Tom, we can start with you. Where are you and your organization on the digital journey, and what does that mean to you and your people?
We've made a pretty significant step forward with it. It isn't the end of the journey. That was part of the battle as well, is getting people out of kind of project mode, one-time investment mode. We're going to go do this big digital transformation, and then we're done with that for a while. And so we are on the backside of a major platform build to create a digital capability that I would argue rivals a set of capabilities you can get with banks that pay a lot more money than we do for technology. So, we have biometric authentication. We were live day one when Apple's iOS 10 came out with facial recognition. We were live day one with that. Bill pay, tap pay. We've made it a critical piece of functionality for our customer. And it derives from a decision by Craig and his executive team to make customer experience a critical piece of how we operate in our market. And in today's market, right, as our president of Retail Bank would say, exceptional customer experience today is an exceptional digital experience. Mm-hmm. So we're well on the way on that path, but now the conversation turns to what does that look like then elsewhere? So if we're about to roll out a new account opening, online new account opening that's less than 5 minutes, we should take that into the branch. We should have that anywhere that we operate, not just on a mobile or on an internet platform. Mm-hmm. So the dialogue around how do you take digital into all of your interactions and how do you move your experiences into self-service experiences is probably the major component of our digital strategy at this point.
How did you define what digital meant to TCF? That seems to be a interesting question, right?
Again, we
who and specifically focusing on who was part of that conversation?
I think we brought a perspective. We brought some technology people into the organization that had a different orientation, having come from retail.
Okay.
And we brought a perspective that said, this is what digital looks like. And you lay out an argument for, again, you draw parallels to other industries that are farther disrupted or farther ahead in the disruption curve than you are. And it's pretty easy to, if you have, again, humble, intellectually humble people on the other end of the conversation, it's pretty easy to start to make an impact. But then digital meant customer experience. Digital meant more what it felt like to be a customer than what it meant to take cost out of our organization. So we didn't orient digital around, hey, how much of our work can we move to somebody else? We oriented it around, what does it feel like to do business with us, and what should it feel like to do business with us?
And did anything like, well, I can get an Uber by doing this, and I can go to Amazon and do that? I mean, were those kinds of conversations going on?
Absolutely. Again, that's part of that board conversation we had. With the example that, so we used a few examples from other industries and how radically and how quickly change could happen, right? So Uber was the best example. The argument I made around Uber is the taxi industry was a fast follower with an app called iHail. So I asked the board, all right, raise your hand if you have Uber. They all raise their hand, which is not a surprise. Raise your hand if you have iHail. Not a single one of them raise your hand. You cannot be a fast follower in this space. You cannot, right? You cannot wait for somebody else to set the market and then figure out how to get a little piece of that as well. The other example that we talked about is Venmo. So Venmo, if you're not familiar with it, is a P2P app. It has gone from, over the course of 2013 to 2016, when I did this conversation, it had gone from facilitating basically $0 in payments to $3 trillion in payments in 3 years. And I asked the board, anybody use Venmo? One person on the board used Venmo. He was our 55-year-old board member who had kids in college. I said, I guarantee you every one of your kids is using Venmo. And that is a app you will never get back. The Venmo now, a non-banking organization, is facilitating payments for a generation that you will never get back. So wipe that one off. What else are we going to protect so that they don't steal it from us? So it doesn't, again, you get your term, intellectually humble people, they'll get woken up pretty quick.
Tiffany, you have anything to add to that around your experience with digital at Cargill? You already spoke to it.
Yeah. So maybe from the top of the house, Cargill has declared digitalization and analytics as one of the top 5 capabilities we will develop in the company. And our CEO has been very vocal about saying we want to be known as a technology company, which is quite exciting for all of us in the field. And so that has also then launched really a lot of education in the organization about what does that mean. We've invested to kind of go up that curve that you talked about how do we move from, we're scouting and we have an innovation capability and we can go scale that. So we've had to get out ahead and develop that. But, the reality is we have to make digital real for 153,000 employees. And it means different things to different people. So to kind of simplify, what is it? We talked about 3 major outcomes. So through digital, we can create new products and services for our customers. So let me give you an example of that. In my business, we provide feed to farmers, whether you're a shrimp farmer or dairy cattle or swine, whatever species it is. We now are launching digital products. So we launched a product called iQuatic, which is starting to transform the shrimp industry. Now they have their farm on the phone in a business that was highly manual for centuries. Wow. So new products and services, we've talked to them and we're all very passionate about the customer experience as well. So we've talked about that will transform the experience our customers have in doing business with us. Gives us different avenues to help educate them on what Cargill knows and how we can help improve their businesses. And the third piece is, as a 153-year-old company, we also have to rewire ourselves. And so now when we get into that piece, you think about the flows across our business, whether it's the flow of products and services, the flow of data, the flow of ideas, or even the flow of people. You know, there's a lot of manual work in those flows. Digital is a way for us to kind of rip down the silos, streamline our business, and become much more efficient. And those are definitions that seem to be resonating well across our organization.
So there's a number of people in the audience, some of whom might be CIOs, some of who might want to be CIOs. What advice do you have for people? I think they would pick up a lot from the conversations that you've had here. But what advice do you have, and what advice maybe do you give the people within your organization about what to think about, what to learn about, how you might have to think about yourself? I don't know. Tom, do you want to?
I've alluded to this a couple different times. There probably isn't a better time in our history to be a technology person. It is more than just an opportunity to help an organization get better at what it does, help it make more money at what it does. It's an opportunity to make a difference, to transform an industry, to transform an outcome. And you got to get your head around that. As a technology executive, you got to get your head around it. That is not what I spent 30 years of my career doing. It's what I spent the last 5 years of my career doing, but it takes a mental shift to realize that the role technology can play is different than what is inherently baked into the way we operate, right? The business analyst role isn't designed to go re-engineer and break down the business model. It's designed to take requirements, right? The structure of how we operate is structured around a historic pattern of how technology helps an organization. And that isn't going to get changed by the marketing executive or the finance executive. In fact, they're going to get in the way of you trying to change that. That's going to get changed by the CIO. And it's a long journey, but it starts with having a strategy acumen and a compelling vision for how technology can help in your industry.
We could probably have a panel just on that
Yeah.
topic alone. But, you know, I mentioned earlier, I didn't start out in Cargill as a technologist. I started as a scientist. And so I've had kind of a non-traditional path to this role. But what I've learned along the way is, you know, when you get to the CIO role, I've found it's less about your technology skills, it's more about your executive skills. And so, you know, there's not a day that I go home thinking, man, I knew it all today. And so what I quickly learned is so much of the success is about the talent that you have on the team. So, you know, number one, I would say learn to be a talent magnet. You know, find people who are smarter than you, find people who are absolutely passionate about what we do, and make sure you create that environment where they can just really be unleashed and thrive. And that'll always be a success factor. You know, the second thing I've learned is, as the change instigator, we're typically saying yes to really gnarly problems that come with risks and challenges most people wouldn't even shake a stick at. And we just do that every day like it's normal. And so I think, you know, as a CIO, you got to be a bit fearless and be willing to take on those big risks and challenges. But you also have to have a keen sense for, you know, finding the risks and managing the risks. Mm-hmm. So it's a balance. Mm-hmm. You know, we talked about tech fluency. So sometimes when you walk in the room, there's automatically a wall that can go up because what we do is a bit of a black box. And so I think bridging that and helping to educate and be there and understanding how our business models work and what we're there to help grow and enable the organization and being able to have those conversations so that, you know, digital is accessible and a path to value is key. And then how you bring that network along is super critical as well. So I think what I have found is if you're preparing for a CIO role, as much as you're seeking to understand the technology, which will be different tomorrow, you know, make sure that you're paying attention to those executive skills and how you show up and lead that part of the organization.
Khalid, anything you would add to that?
Advantage of going last, all the good points are taken. So no, I would actually just reiterate a couple, right? So one, talent is a big, big thing. I was in Friday working with a tech CIO, transitioning into that role, and brilliant technologically. Got there because of the brilliance in architecting the whole tech environment for that company, that tech company that drove revenue only through technology, but struggled with influence and relationships and talent, right? And so that's the softer skills. I think if you get to be the opportunity to be a CIO, your technical skills are there, right? So no question about that, and I think that's important. But I think I just reiterate, although these patterns exist and so on, you can't keep an eye off the ball from operational excellence, right? You cannot, and by the way, your talent can help you with that, right? If that's not your core strength, look for people who can actually do that for you. But having a good team around you, I've found, is the only way you can succeed as a leader. And CIOs are new kids on the block. I mean, relatively new to the real C-suite, right? And so there's a little bit of a learning curve, and that's fine. But it's actually the team that you bring to the table. Almost every CIO that I've worked with that has gone through a transition brings in some external influence that actually drives change, starts to drive change. They alone cannot do it, right? So you got to infuse new talent. They both have kind of mentioned that, but I think infusing new talent to drive change is an ongoing thing. And by the way, change is relentless, right? You can't, as Tom said, you can't stop and wait, oh, that project is done. Digital disruption is going to go on, right? And so it's going to be a new thing tomorrow. Just to answer your question around, did we actually ask that question? What does digital mean to you? And the three things that came from a survey, one was really around customer experience, engagement, et cetera. The second was almost equal number of people said transforming my business, right? Whether that's a particular function like finance or supply chain or operations or whatever, but that was a big part. And then the third one was actually engaging employees, employee experience, right? And so all three of those rated pretty high, and technology was obviously kind of an underlying concept across. But that was kind of the definition as we asked them, and there was a broad consensus on those three things, and then there was a long tail, right, of other things.
And Judy, maybe just to add, you said something too that was really critical, and it's becoming a little bit of a mantra in our company, is you have to move from thinking you know everything to you're learning everything.
Yeah.
And so I think it's super critical in a CIO role is be curious and keep learning.
Absolutely agree.
Can I add one more thought?
Absolutely.
Just sort of something to think about when you think about the role of a technology leader, I think, in today's world. I think each one of us would be well served to accept the mantle of a cultural warrior at some point. It doesn't mean you have to drive the whole cultural change for the organization. But it's there, it's real. So again, this is one of those things that I think I walked into accidentally and realized after the fact there's a value in doing this. We've been doing hackathons inside the IT organization, right? So entirely innovation day. If you're not familiar with the hackathon, you just get a bunch of people together, and the idea is you got to solve a problem, whatever problem you decide to come up with. You get into a group of people. I like this problem, and you solve it in the day. That's the only rule. You got to solve it in the day. You have to hack something together. And it exploded inside the organization. We did it just within IT. We did it on purpose. We did it to kind of foster a culture inside of IT, and it resonated across the broader organization. And it was an aha moment for me that, again, part of the journey of letting tech help drive your business strategy is to let the culture of tech be a core of your business strategy as well.
Yeah.
That's on us.
Yeah. You know, and I'll need you to use your brain because I can't remember his name. There's an organization called Not Impossible, and it's run by, I can't remember his name, but if you do a Google search, Mick Eberling, yay. It's a fabulous example, and one of Mick's lines is, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you know, something was impossible. 20 years ago, did we think we would be married to our phones, and that would have our calendar, and that it would be as much of a computer as anything else? And so they do some pretty amazing things with creating, prosthetic hands for people who can't handle it. They created when you can't speak and you have to like look with your eyes on a thing to talk, and made it affordable and so on. I mean, it is just astounding, but his whole premise is 5 or 10 years ago, that was viewed as impossible, and now we did it. So it might be something just to file away. We have about 10-ish minutes or so, I think. Is that right? Or, yeah. Are there questions in the crowd that I sort of feel like Ferris Bueller's Day Off? Anyone? There you go.
Your comment about bringing in talent. What do you look for in your suppliers, your tech suppliers?
Okay, the question was, what do you look for in your tech suppliers, the talent in your tech suppliers?
Everybody has memorized Khalid's contact.
Yeah. Was there another part to that question?
No, I think Tiffany commented on it and brought in Microsoft to meet with your associates. And
I think you got to go back
you ask your,
all the way.
your suppliers to present competing proposals. Do you leverage them for what you can learn?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think some of it starts with more of a workforce strategy. So, what capabilities do we need, and where does it make sense for us to be building and fostering those inside? And where are there people that are better than us or than we will be at that we need to partner with, whether it's running operations or innovation? I'll give you kind of a curveball though. Like one of the things we look for too is cultural fit. So, we're really trying to curate our culture internally. So as we partner with companies, is that going to be complementary to what we're trying to achieve? And so we work with many partners. Oftentimes we are looking at multiple partners to see what they could offer or what's unique about what they do that will complement what we do.
Tom, anything to add?
I would say ditto to all of that. I think different partners serve different needs depending on what the need is. I think of late, we are more likely to ask our partners to show us flexibility and to be less interested in a long-term orientation. The number of times we've signed 5-year deals in the last 5 years is I can maybe count on one hand, and it's because I didn't have a choice. So we're more inclined to require a bit more agility and flexibility and dynamic change demonstrated. That's a cultural component, I think, than we were 15 years ago in IT. But there's still different partners play different roles, and their culture fits the role that you ask them to play.
The one thing I would add that I think we've learned a good lesson on, though, when we do partner and it's a long-term partnership, what we have to be careful of is that, we're hiring them for specific skills and something they bring to the table. So we don't want to impose how we do things necessarily on them. We want them to bring what they do to the table and make sure that works together and they're able to bring their best and brightest.
One of my former bosses was the CIO of an organization I was with, used to call that pickling. Whether it was an employee or a vendor, he would say, someone starts to work here and within 6 months they get pickled into how we do it. And you don't want that. Yes. Yes, you.
One of the changes you're seeing in the C-suite also now in some companies is the appointment of a chief data officer in addition to a chief information officer. How do you guys see that? Is that a good thing, a bad thing? Is it antagonistic? Is it another person to cooperate with?
So the question is, I just want to repeat it for the people in the back, the influx of a chief data officer, and do you see it there? What kind of issues might that cause?
It's pretty prevalent in the banking world because of the criticality of being able to establish quality of data and lineage and integrity of data. So the dynamic works though, right? You just have to get clarity around what are the accountabilities of a chief data officer versus a technology organization, whether that's the CIO or the CTO. Chief data officer becomes accountable for the data quality, the data needs, not necessarily how that data gets handled, managed, and or provided and presented. So it's very common for us to be having a conversation around data needs versus our platform, our enterprise data repository, the big data platforms, and how we present it and how we make the data available. But it isn't without its effort, right? It takes a lot of connecting and being on the same page. I think we're fortunate that the chief digital officer is in a technology organization, but that's another one that's equally, I think, is, if not more so, contentious sometimes between the IT organization and a tech-like role inside of a company.
So I'd say I agree with all that. And by the way, yes, it is much more prevalent in financial services than it is in others. Chief digital officer, on the other hand, is more prevalent in other industries like retail and so on. What is really interesting, though, is that I feel that chief data officer may be addressing a very different problem, but chief digital officer, I feel that if there is a need for a chief digital officer, the CIO somewhere hasn't done their job, right, in a way, because they don't have enough credibility to be viewed as the external and the internal face of technology, right? And so to me, I think data is a very different problem, and FP&A and finance group really usually owns that, and in financial services, and that's great, as long as they have a good connection point. But from a chief digital officer, in our survey, we found about 14% of the companies have it. Have a chief digital officer. About half the times they're reporting into, or IT is reporting into them, right? And so, and about half the times they're outside. But when they are outside of the IT organization, it creates another silo, right? And so, to me, it's almost a failure of IT to build credibility if you have a separate standalone chief digital officer role.
Well, you sort of create a have and have not, right? You have the cool kids doing all the digital stuff, and then you have the other people doing the things that aren't quite as good or fun or perceived as valuable, even though it all is. Any other questions? Yes?
So I thought this dichotomy between these two roles for a CIO, the operation versus innovation, is quite interesting, and different trends there. But it seems to me that there are two very different roles, and they require different skill sets. And is there a move to even partition these two functions into different, under different leadership, for example?
Yeah, and that's why you see the chief digital officer role,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. The question is the difference between the, running the operation and being innovative, and how do you, there are very different skill sets around those two. And the question is, how do you get those to work together? I would say, or split them out.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with splitting apart is that creates another silo. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. So an organization, a manufacturing organization, created a digital function, which started with about 40 people. In about 3 years, it was 1,100 people, right? And it's another organization that
It's a
you now
shadow
have to
IT.
deal with,
Yeah, it's a
right?
shadow
So
IT
the
organization.
question is, how do you lead an organization where you personally, as we've talked about, right? I mean, you personally, it doesn't matter what your skill set is. You're a leader trying to attract talent that can balance these capabilities that you have. And so your job as a leader is, I 100% agree, is to be a talent magnet, to be able to balance these activities. And your personal brand and talent is important. And yes, you need to understand and drive change and drive kind of business value. But to me, I think your team becomes really important in driving those two seemingly disparate roles. But to me, I think it has to be together. Otherwise, it's just another silo that creates another set of issues.
Yeah, Tom?
I was just going to say, I would ask you, I wonder if you've seen this, again, not in major numbers, but I've witnessed a bit of a trend where an organization who's truly trying to signal that they think of technology as an innovation function puts the CTO title at the top of the stack, not the CIO title.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that that's necessarily right, but it feels like a way to say we think about it differently than the old way, the traditional CIO way.
Yeah. Tiffany?
I'll add, because I think what you said is very interesting, and I see that a little bit, but I'll talk to you how we've handled it. Because I think when we had one team trying to do both, it feels like operations always wins. So you have to make sure that's solid, and then the innovation piece can become kind of that hobby or that, the hackathon and those kind of things, which is good, but when we want to be really focused on it. So we did, within our IT function, we created something that we now call digital labs. And so it is a separate team, but part of the whole IT organization. And so within that, we have a group called Apollo that's out there scouting new technologies. They're in the startup community. If any of you saw, like Monday night, we had the TechStars pitch day where we've co-invested with Ecolabs on tech startups. So that's part of the work that we're doing. And then we have a group that really helps go out into the field, shoulder to shoulder, agile, sees what our customer needs are, and they're doing rapid prototyping and those kind of things, and helping to launch some commercial products. And if those are things that are kind of internal type innovation, there's a point where we may move them into global IT then for the scale. So, but there's trade-offs. It can be hard in the operating model to know who's doing what, and what we found is important is that we make sure the whole team feels like they're winning. It's not just the innovation capability that's driving the value.
And I think that's where it actually goes to the leaders as well. I mean, you can set the tone, you can set the culture, and so on. Well, thank you, guys. I think this was, I'll just say a couple things and then you can close it out. I really appreciate your time and energy. I think it was an interesting conversation for me. I have a little parting gift for you. One is a little bottle of champagne to celebrate how wonderful you are, fabulous, and so on. You get a little tchotchke from the TLI program, and then there's also a Starbucks card so that after you drink the champagne, you can drink coffee and drive home appropriately. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.
And thank you all for coming.
Okay, thank you.